shall return.
Yeah.
That's the same. I can't get away with it.
Thank you. Well, she's still hanging in. Yeah.
Dave, don't put pressure on this. Don't- Yes, I do. I never break the rules.
We all shepherd this thing. We all
Is it too late to resign? Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know, my name is Blake Eady, and I'm the chair of the board of the Gathering of Baptists. It is my honor to welcome you who are here in person and those of you who are online. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Gathering of Baptists is meeting today in the city of Toronto. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and now is the home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today, I'm extremely excited about our guest speaker. In fact, I've already got her to sign 2 of my books. I was first introduced to her through the book that she wrote with her husband called Romans Disarmed. And I said to many that I think it's the best book that was ever written on the book of Romans. So I really look forward to sharing with us this day. And before I turn it over to Karen Turner for our centering thoughts, I'm going to call upon Victoria to bring greetings on behalf of Calvary Baptist Church.
I feel like I'm the last person standing. Rex and Rita have both come down with COVID, so at the last minute, I've been asked to welcome you. The online, not so much, but the in-person. Thank you for coming to Calvary and putting up with our little bit disjointed this morning because, as I said, 2 of the organizers came down with COVID. That it's so lovely to see. Some of you have ministered here for years. Many of you have been asked to preach here. So if you haven't been asked to preach here, your time is coming. We will ask you to preach to us since you know the way here. So we are delighted to be able to host and hope everyone feels warm, welcomed, and a feeling of awe as we're in this lovely congregation. Thank you.
Karen, would you now lead us in centering thoughts?
Good afternoon. Before we start the centering thoughts on the topic for today, because I know we're all aching with grief and anxiety over the war raging now in Israel and Palestine, I'd like us to begin this time of reflection with a prayer for peace. Let us pray. 2 peoples, 1 land, 3 faiths, 1 root, 1 earth, 1 mother, 1 sky, 1 beginning, 1 future, 1 destiny, one broken heart, one God. God of peace, we pray to you. Grant us a vision of unity. May we see the many in the one and the one in the many. Guide us gently and firmly toward each other, toward peace. And that prayer was written by Rabbi Sheila Weinberg, who is a U.S. American rabbi. But the theme of our gathering today is recognizing our place in creation, Christianity, and the climate crisis. And we'll be exploring this question today with my friend Sylvia Keesmaat. And we'll be talking about what the climate crisis has to do with the church. Is there any climate crisis wisdom to be found in the Bible? We are all aware that the world is in turmoil more than usual these last few years. We lived through a global pandemic for 3 years. Since then, 2 major wars have erupted that seriously threaten global stability. Millions of people around the world are displaced from their homes, precariously trying to stay alive and feed their families, dependent on aid from afar. And through all this, we're experiencing unprecedented weather patterns across the globe: floods, droughts, hurricanes, wildfires. Apocalyptic is the word I keep hearing. Terrifying if you think about it too much. Overwhelming. So, we often find ourselves trying not to think about it. But what do we do with the feelings, the anxiety, the grief, the anger? How do we stay lovingly open-hearted when everything in us wants to shut down? Today, we're actually looking for wisdom in the Bible, where followers of Jesus have always looked. Can the scriptures help us in any way understand what's happening? To what are we as followers of Jesus called to in times of extremity? Because that's pretty much where we seem to be. As our theme today implies, we're thinking about our place as human beings, as part of creation, as part of the family of earth, in the light of the wisdom of the Bible. So this brief time of reflection and prayer will consist of thoughtfully listening to 4 passages of Scripture and closing with a responsive prayer. Our readers today were supposed to be Rex and Rita Deverell. However, as you've just heard, both of them, Rex is very sick and Rita is here, but she has tested positive, so stay away from her. So in their place, we have Victoria Drysdale and Elle Roberts. And after they read each of the passages, we'll take a moment of silence as we reflect upon what we've heard. So we'll start with an excerpt from Genesis chapter 2. It's from the Inclusive Bible, which I've come to really appreciate. And so when you listen for what we learn of the Creator's intention for us earth creatures.
When Creator made the heavens and the earth, there was still no wild bush on the earth, nor had any wild plant sprung up. For Creator had not yet sent rain to the earth, and there was no human being to till the soil. Instead, a flow of water would well up from the ground and irrigate the soil. So Creator fashioned an earth creature out of the clay of the earth, and blew into its nostrils the breath of life, and the earth creature became a living being. The Creator planted a garden and placed in it the earth creature that had been made, so that it might cultivate and care for the land.
Next, we're going to hear some stern words from the prophet Hosea. The Lord accuses all who live in the land.
Listen to the words of the Lord, O people of Israel. For the Lord accuses all who live in the land. There is no fidelity of kindness, no knowledge of God throughout the land. There is only cursing, lying, murder, and infidelity. These things run rampant throughout the land, and mayhem begets mayhem. The land is in mourning because of this, and all who live in it are languishing, along with the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea.
Listen to a familiar passage from Romans 8, but in the words of the First Nations version of the New Testament. As you listen, what do you hear as God's dream for the earth and our calling within that dream?
It is clear to me that the suffering we now share with him is a small price to pay compared to the beauty and honor that is coming to us. The creation all around us is waiting on tiptoe for Creator's sons and daughters to be revealed in the full beauty of who he has created them to be. Creation itself became weak and powerless, unable to fulfill its destiny, not by its own choice, but because of the one who had power over it. But there is hope. The Creator has a plan to restore human beings. Then all of creation will share in the freedom of the life of beauty and harmony given to all of Creator's children. It is plain to see that all creation is still groaning in pain, like a mother giving birth. And even we, who have first tasted of his Spirit, are groaning on the inside as we wait for Creator to finish the purpose for which he took us into his family by giving us new bodies that will never die. This is what Creator was planning when he set us free by his Spirit. It is the hope of all creation. We cannot see this hope yet, for who hopes what has already happened? So we must be patient and wait for Creator to bring everything to completion.
Finally, from the prophet Habakkuk, how can we remain open-hearted when everything in us just wants to shut down?
Though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the yields ye no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights.
Thank you. Now we're going to pray. And I've been an Anglican the last few years, so this is going to be a prayer that has a response from you. So when I say, Lord, in your mercy, you say, save us. Loving God, you created human beings out of the earth with material from the stars. You breathed your spirit, your ancient love into us and imprinted us with your image. We remember Jesus' words that the one who has dominion must be servant of all. You have called us to care for your magnificent earth creation, to serve our kin, all those who share the earth with us. Lord, in your mercy, save us. But we have forgotten our place. We imagined we were masters, not servants. The more we learned about your evolving creation masterpiece, instead of rejoicing in wonder and gratitude, the more we took and used, burned and destroyed without care for your beautiful work, for our human siblings, and for our non-human kin. Lord, in your mercy, because we have abused our calling, forgotten our place, desecrated what we did not understand, now we stand on the precipice of climate disaster. We, your human children, have done this. Lord, in your mercy. Many of us, especially the powerful, rich, and comfortable among us, ignore the terrifying evidence of climate disaster and continue as we always have, living with the tattered illusion of an inert earth with unlimited resources. And those of us who are beginning to see, to understand what we have done, ache with anxiety and grief at how we have wounded the living earth, our mother, at the climate changes and catastrophes that are picking up speed, despairing at times, doing small things that make small differences, knowing it is not enough. Lord, in your mercy. Creator God, in your mercy, save us. Spirit of love, help us in our weakness. Intercede for us with your sighs too deep for words. We hang on to the promise that even this peril cannot separate us from you and from your ancient love, from your vision of a beloved earth community. Holy One, teach us our place once again. We are listening. Amen.
Karen, thank you. Thank you for focusing our attention, our thoughts, and our wills as we begin this day. I'm Dave Ogilvie, and along with Karen, I co-chair the program committee of the Gathering of Baptists. And on behalf of our committee, I want to say thank you for coming today and being part of our gathering. We're delighted that you are here in person and that others are joining us online as well. The other members of our program committee are also here. Gary Caldwell is a member of our committee, and Larry Ogden. And Larry is joining us online all the way from Vancouver today. So Larry, welcome. Good to see you too. This is a quick plug for the program committee, if I may. We try very intentionally to put together programs twice a year that you will find informative, inspiring, invigorating, and we know that the real reason you come together is just to see one another and to hang out together for a little while. But we hope that we create a little something else to go around that's meaningful for you too. If you have ideas about programming that you'd like us to consider, don't hesitate to pass those along. If you've ever thought, I could do that, or maybe I could even do better than that, and you'd like to come and sit on our program committee, this is an invitation. We'd love to welcome you. We do all our meetings online now, so it doesn't matter where you live. That's not an excuse. You can come and be a part of our committee, and we'd love to have you join us. I want to say on behalf of us all, a thank you to Calvary Baptist Church for hosting us today. It is good to be here, and we are most grateful for the hospitality that you have already provided and that will continue, I know, throughout our afternoon together. We've had good food. We've had a warm welcome. I want to say a special thank you to Kent, who most of you won't see, but is busily working behind the scenes to make sure that you can see what we want you to see, especially those of you who are at home and watching online. Kent, thank you so much for your hard work on our behalf today. Quick run through of what's about to happen. In a moment, we're going to officially introduce our guest for the day, and Sylvia is going to speak with us for about an hour. And then we're going to take a stretch break, a quick one, and then we're going to come back and look for an opportunity to engage Sylvia in some conversation with some questions. So be thinking about what you want to ask as she's doing her presentation. That Q&A time is an important part of our experience together. So plan to be a part of that. Those of you who are online, there are actually a couple of ways that you can interact with this. One is a little reactions button on your screen. So you can kind of go woohoo or thumbs up or I'm not sure what else you can. I think you can even clap in reactions. So if you feel moved and the spirit, stirring you in some way and you want to react, you can do that. There is also, though, a chat function. And especially when we get to the Q&A, if you want to ask a question, you can pose your question in that chat box. And who knows, I might actually figure out how to get it out of there and pose it to the rest of the group. So we're going to try that at least. Hope that works. Following the Q&A session, we will soon draw the program portion of our day to a close. But then we will have our annual general meeting as an organization. It's not long. It's not too stuffy. It is important. And we hope that all of you will plan to stay and to be part of that. Again, those of you online will be able to even vote through the chat function, maybe if we can figure that out. And we want you to be a part of that reporting and that decision making that we're engaged in too as an organization. We're glad to have you as part of our gathering today. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask Karen to come back and to introduce our guest to us. Thanks, Karen.
I can't tell you how thrilled I am to introduce Sylvia to you. She's been a good friend of mine for a number of years. You've read her bio on the poster, and it's been posted on the screen and stuff, so I'm not going to go over it all. It's just that I've always been really impressed that she did her doctorate at Oxford under N.T. Wright. So that may mean something to some of the pastors here. And she and her husband, her esteemed husband, Brian Walsh, have both been professors at Toronto School of Theology. They are not at present. Brian's retired. And Sylvia has moved on to doing something so unique. I got to tell you about it. It's called Bible Remixed, and it's an online learning community where she offers 6 to 8 week long courses on biblical. She's a biblical scholar, so it's all on biblical issues. And it's helping people explore through learning what it means to be a follower of Jesus in our time. So just for example, right now, she's just finishing up a 6-week course called Reading Paul in the Shadow of Empire. And then in Advent, she's doing one called Inhabiting the Psalms, Ancient Psalms for a Time of Crisis. So, and I can tell you from experience, because I've audited some of her courses at Wycliffe College and I've done a couple of her online courses, this is not fluff. This is stuff that makes you work, makes you think, makes you evaluate how you understood the faith. So, and then Sylvia and Brian, they've been married for a long time, but they work together. Like they've just published, just before the pandemic, a book that they wrote together called Romans Disarmed. And actually, Blake, I know, has 2 copies here because he got her to autograph them. And if you want to hear Blake's take on Romans Disarmed, just speak to him afterwards. But they also work together. They have an organic farm not too far from where Heather and I now live, just outside Fenland Falls. And Sylvia is an expert in permaculture and does a lot of teaching and influencing people on care of the land as well. So she's a very neat person, and I count her among my friends, and I'm proud to do that. So Sylvia, I'm going to move this over here and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen, for that lovely introduction. If things were flipped, I could be introducing my wonderful friend Karen and telling you all the stuff she does, but most of you know that, I think, already. And we're actually so delighted that Karen and Heather moved up to our neighborhood. The only drawback to that is normally I'd be coming to Toronto to speak, and then I'd be heading over to Karen and Heather's for the night. But I can't do that anymore because they don't live here anymore. So I'm actually going to be driving home today. And it's a delight to be here with you today at Calvary Baptist. I was so delighted when I sat down and saw your window up here. I've part of what I do in my teaching, I've been kind of trying to decolonize people's images of the biblical story, and part of that is the white Jesus image, right? So to see a stained glass window that isn't a white Jesus is just so lovely. I actually found a funny comic yesterday. It's one of those classic pictures of Jesus sitting there in a long white robe with kids and old people with big beards and stuff. And what it says is, and there I was, the only white guy in Jerusalem. I was just like, this is, yeah. So it's good to be here with you, and good to talk about our place in creation and what our calling might be in this time of increasing crisis. And given all that's been happening in the world, not just in the last week, but the last few years, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about grief, because I think that's the place where many of us are coming from these days. Even before the war in Israel, Palestine, and the war in Ukraine, many of us were increasingly waking up with a sense of grief in our hearts. And I know that young people are struggling with this. My kids are certainly struggling with this. And when I talk to my one daughter, who works every summer as a pirate, actually here in Toronto, on a boat down in the harbor. She's an actor, so she doesn't want to have kids. This, the way the world is going, that's not something she's interested in doing. So I'd like to start by just asking you, and maybe putting up on the board here, just what are the things that you are grieving, particularly in relation to what's happening with creation? What is it about the climate crisis? When you think about the future, what causes you grief? Pardon?
Genocide of animals.
The genocide of animals. Okay. So yeah. Yeah. Genocide literally actually just means killing of people, but yes. Extinction. So we're in the sixth great extinction, right? And the first human-caused extinction. So animals disappearing. What else? Anything else that causes you grief? Is it Nick? I'm thinking of the climate crisis particularly, yeah. But I mean, a lot of things are interconnected. So go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Fatalism. So this sense that do you kind of mean the sense that we're like heading towards destruction and there's no other way for this to end? Okay, that's that's a great one. That we have no choice for healing, right? No possibility of redemption. That there's no, we're on a course and it looks like we're not going to be able to turn back from that course. So that's a really important reason for grief. Yes, at the back. Okay. So that's kind of linked to the fatalism a little bit. Well, maybe not. Rage and what's another word for I don't care? Pardon? Apathy, that's it. Thank you. I knew there was one short, pithy word that. Uh, so, yeah, the rage and apathy that we see around us in relation to what's happening to creation. What else, Nick? Okay, so self-sabotage, protectionism. So this sense that, look, if this is the way it's going to be, what can I do to protect, my own interests, my place, where I am in the world? Okay. Oh, mhm. Okay, great. So that's so I got the protectionism out of, but the perfectionism. So yes, wind is also causes problems for birds, say, so we should not use wind. Or the sense that because there's no perfect solution, let's not we're not going to try any kind of solution. And of course, I live in a solar powered house that's completely off grid. So I'm fairly well aware of the fact that there are no perfect solutions because we have a bank of batteries in our basement. They're terrible. Um, but what solar has been teaching us is how to do without, right? We don't have most appliances because solar can't support a lot of those things. So um, there are lifestyle changes that happen, even if there aren't perfect solutions. But there always are, particularly if you're working in the environmental movement, this constant pushback of that's not good enough, that's not good enough, that's not good enough. Um, what else? Anything else giving you grief? Yes. Okay. Okay, the difference between personal and corporate responsibility. This one is huge because and it does give rise to a lot of grief because when it comes right down to it, we can make all the personal changes that we want, but we're caught in a system that is deeply embedded in the oil industry, right? In fossil fuels. That's the system that we're part of. And so there's this constant push, and I think the corporations, particularly big oil, has been particularly good at kind of suggesting, if we use different light bulbs and if we all recycle, then then we're doing what we can. Whereas there are these larger societal structures that need to change that won't change as long as our governments continue to pin uh, particularly monetary hopes on the oil sands, for instance, in Canada. Anything else? Any other reasons? Yes, Blake.
You have those who, for purposes, are raping the land, yet it is creating economic problems.
Okay, so kind of the increasing, I'm just going to shorten that to kind of the increasing poverty that's resulting. Does that summarize kind of what you're saying? Like there's this economic circle that we're stuck in that's bad for creation, but then that creates its own problems. And actually, it's not just economic problems that the environmental crisis is creating. It's not just poverty, but we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that these wars we're feeling have environmental roots as well. If Hamas's strikes against Israel in Gaza have something to do with the fact that water has been cut off to both the West Bank and to Gaza by Israel. West Bank, um, it's very hard for Palestinians to get the water they need in the West Bank. And they're not even allowed to build cisterns right? Both of my children have been to Palestine, my youngest children have been to Palestine, and they were involved in building an underground system there at a place called Tent of Nations, which some of you might know about. And it had to be hidden because if they built it above ground, Israeli bulldozers would come and destroy it, right? So the war in Syria has environmental roots. It began because of some famine and drought years that were caused by climate change and an influx of farmers into the cities. And that sparked the social unrest. That was kind of lit the fuse for the ongoing crisis in Syria. So there are all of these things uh, are part of the whole equation around climate change. Anything else? Yes, Dave. Dis- Okay, dislocation and displacement that is resulting as a result of that is resulting from climate change. So not just people who are have to move because of war, but because of climate catastrophe. We've been experiencing this in Canada for the last couple of years. If you think about the wildfires, I mean, the people who had to leave Lytton 2 years ago were then Lytton was hit with flooding, then it was hit with another fire. I mean, those folks have been unable to get back home, right? So we have displacement here as well as around the world. So those are things that cause grief. Anything else? Yes. Okay. So yes, the exhaustion around trying to survive and the inability to that leads to in making choices that are good for the environment. And this is a really important one. Actually, I'm glad you articulated it. I mean, I see it when I'm on the board of an organization called Sanctuary, which operates out of downtown Toronto on Charles Street. So we have drop-in programs for people who are on the streets, and you will find almost any drop-in program that's ministering to people who are on the streets. They're not making good environmental choices, right? It's a lot of disposable things. It's a lot of cheap food. It's a lot of well, I shouldn't say it's crappy food, but it's cheap, right? There's this need to get things as cheaply as possible. And none of that is good for creation. But this other need is so great. This other need to work with those who are on the streets is so great that making these other choices that are better are either economically not viable or they take more time. It takes more time to do things well for creation. So it doesn't happen. In fact, my daughter Madeline, the one who works as a pirate in the summer, is also a personal support worker and worked at L'Arche for a number of years, actually in this end of the city, and complained after moving out about being raised with too much privilege. I was like, what are you talking about? You guys didn't have computers, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't get to play video games. Like, there's all these things, you did have 35 acres of woods, which I think is privilege, but, and she said, oh, it's none of that, Mom. It's the organic food. She said, on my budget for my house at L'Arche, we can only buy the cheapest food, the cheapest hamburger. That's what we eat. She said, so I can't live a life where I'm eating the kind of food, the good food I was raised on. And now that she's living on her own, she's in that, not even cooking for L'Arche, she's in that same situation because food prices have gone up so much, right? And it's interesting. When I was in my 20s, my parents were helping me with rent I guess they were still giving me money, but I mean, I'm helping my kids with food a lot. I find it's helping them to buy better food. Um, all of these things, all of these things contribute to grief that we feel about what's happening with creation, with the environment right now. One thing that we don't have up here that kind of goes up here with the genocide, I think, is grief over the loss of the places that we love. This is tied up with dislocation, but that when we go back to the places, many of us, where we were raised, and we see, or places that not just where we were raised, where we live, and discover that a wildfire has gone through or there has been flooding. Like there are many people um, grieving over the loss of the places that they loved. And this is something actually that I think this is the word for that. This is the word. That's not going to be big enough. Let me put this over here. You can tell I'm Dutch background. I want to squeeze as much on a page as I can because I don't want to use a new piece of paper. Solastalgia is the word for this. This was a word coined by somebody named Glenn Albrecht, who writes about the climate crisis, and he talks about the loss of the places that we've loved when we're still in those places, because they've changed so dramatically. So the fact that the creatures that used to be in those places are no longer there, right? That when we were kids, I mean, I remember collecting caterpillars all the time when I was kids. It's hard to find caterpillars often now, right? They're just not there. The birds that used to be so prevalent in some places, not there anymore. The fact that people in North America are starting to talk about this does say something about our privileged situation. Because solastalgia, of course, is something that Indigenous peoples have been feeling in Canada for a couple of centuries now, right? The loss of the places they loved. All kinds of people who have been pushed out of their places as refugees, who have been displaced by war, also feeling solastalgia. The Palestinians, who since 1948 have been pushed out of their land, also feeling this. So this is something that Indigenous writers especially talk about. So I'm trying to make this so I'm a little less, I'm not having quite so much static on there. That might be better. Indigenous writers especially talk about this, talk about how, if we're worried about the climate apocalypse, Indigenous peoples have already been through it and have things to teach us. And I think that's very important to remember. But we're not just grieving the past, what we've lost, but we're also grieving the future we had hoped for, right? Many of us are thinking about what's going to happen with climate change. This is where my kids are, right? They're thinking they don't want to have kids because that stable future of a healthy world, that's not there anymore. So there's grief around the loss of that future as well, not just what we had in the past, but what's coming. And I think we're also grieving our connection with nature. And that's where the extinction point comes in as well. So we were created, and this is a grief I think many of us don't realize because of the way we've shaped our world, right? We were created, as one author, Francis Weller, puts it, for an engagement with a strange and beautiful otherness. Right? We were created for this full-orbed engagement with the world, a world of diverse sights, diverse sounds, diverse smells. You know that feeling if you ever go camping and you step out of your car, out of your canoe, and you smell, oh, the cedar trees and the pine trees and the moist earth. And if it's spring, you might smell that spicy smell that the pollen of the poplar trees have, right? All of that. It's that kind of complex sensory overload or fullness that we're supposed to have all the time with the world. But instead, we've created environments that, and we've created our interactions with each other to be kind of manufactured in terms of scent, right? We like it if there's actually no smells. That's supposed to be good. And same with textures, the rough textures of the bark of trees, the fur of animals, the feel of grass on your hands. But instead, we've created a smooth world where what we touch doesn't challenge us that much. So what happens when this deeper interaction with the wild other is lost to us, when our bodies are no longer shaped by the cold of the wind, or the need to run softly or swiftly, when we no longer encounter things like the red-belted bumblebee next to the well or the northern flicker on our trees, when crickets no longer sing us to sleep. I know what people do. They get one of these things and they find an app that has the ocean on it or crickets or rain and they put that on. It's like, actually, that's because those were the things that were supposed to lull us to sleep. I'm lucky. I live in the country, so crickets still sing me to sleep in August and September. Though this year they were late. I think, I don't know what happened with the weather, but there was like a 3-week period in July when I expected crickets and there were none. And I actually started to panic. Like, what if this is it? What if they're gone? and then they came. But something happened a little weird around the crickets this year. When we don't have that engagement, there's a word for what that does to us. It's called nature deficit disorder. I've spelled that wrong. Deficit. That might still be wrong. I cannot spell to save my life, so I'm not going to use that as a basis. I think that might be right, actually. Have any of you heard of this, nature deficit disorder? Richard Love has written a book called Last Child in the Woods, which talks about this. But we, and I say this as a grief we don't even know we have, because we don't realize we live in such a manufactured world, how much we miss this. Until sometimes we're out in those places where we're interacting with nature and we feel the calm appear. We have a cedar bush. Half of our bush is maple and half is cedar. And everybody who walks into there says, it feels so peaceful in here. It's like you can feel your blood pressure dropping. It's like, oh, what if that's where we were supposed to be in? If that's actually what blood pressure treatment was supposed to be, that we'd be in the cedar trees. I think the rise of anxiety in our world and young people is because of this nature deficit disorder. My children don't believe this, but I do. That's the disconnect sometimes. And I think we also, and this came up here in the front, I think we're also grieving our complicity in these losses. Right? Like there are ways, we still feel, even though there's this gap between the personal and the corporate, the exhaustion that we have, the apathy that we all sometimes feel about this, like it's just too much. It's too much to have, take any longer. I think this sense that, that we're complicit, we're not doing enough. And that complicity is something that we have because we are powerless. We are so entangled in the system. We have some power, but there is also a sense of powerlessness. And I think, and this is going to lead us into the biblical texts, I think we also grieve because we are called in to the sorrow of creation. So that very first point that someone made, that we grieve the extinctions, we feel sorrow over everything that is being lost in the natural world. And we feel sorrow because the other creatures are feeling sorrow as well. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 8, and that was read for us earlier, where Paul talks about creation groaning in birth pangs. He talks about creation being, sorry, let me just look this up here. I just had one of those moments of where I'm talking to you from handwritten notes today, which is my preferred way of speaking. Karen was like, "Those aren't handwritten notes, are they?" It's like, "Yes, they are," because it's a lot easier to do something a little bit fresh if I'm not reading something. But occasionally, I forget something. Paul talks about creation being in bondage to decay, and waiting for freedom. And he talks about creation groaning, and those who have the first fruits of the Spirit, that's us, also groaning, also sharing in the groaning of creation. And then he goes on a few verses later to talk about the Spirit interceding with groans too deep for words. So that this mourning, this lament of creation is picked up by those who are the image bearers, those who are in Jesus, and it is picked up by the Spirit as well. There is this lament coming from creation, us, and God's very self about what's going on in the world, about this bondage to decay. And I should say, Paul isn't just making a general statement here about, it's a sinful world and creation knows that. In the first century, environmental destruction was talked about, right? Rome, because of the way Rome's empire spread, Rome cut down whole forests. Rome had to keep moving, the Romans, so that they would continually have more forests to cut down, because they created mines as they moved so that they could make metal for armor, for weapons, and so that they could mint coins to pay their soldiers with. But the thing is, when you build mines, you need to shore up those mine shafts with wood, and you need to smelt all that metal. You need fires, right? And you need trees for that. So Rome was on the move, partly as they depleted all the forests in an area. They moved further north. That's why they ended up all the way in Britain. They were looking for fuel, which wood was in the ancient world. It was the oil of the ancient world. Actually, wood was the fuel of the ancient world, and slaves. Slaves provided a lot of the energy in the ancient world. So, and that's the other reason they needed to keep expanding. They needed to keep capturing people, because slavery was not race-based. It was completely based on who conquered whom. And those people became slaves. First extinctions in Europe happened under Rome, in Paul's time. And Paul, of course, was walking Roman roads, which were their own environmental disaster, 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and straight as a ramrod, cutting off streams, creating erosion. So the roads were ecological disasters. The reason they've stayed, some of them. I mean, the Roman road is still the basis of the major motorway in Britain, is because they actually cut so deeply and so wide across the landscape. But Paul, when he walked on Roman roads, also saw how all the landscapes around the villages and cities had been depleted, because so much grain was needed for Rome and for the people in those cities that the land would get depleted, and then they'd cut down more forests and move further out. Also, every veteran got a farm when they left the army after, I think it was 25 years service or 30 years service. And they also started to run out of land for those veterans. So this is when deserts first appeared in Africa, because Rome was cutting down trees to give farms to veterans who grew grain to send to Rome. So there were all these environmental things going on, and people were writing about this. So when Paul says that creation is groaning and is in bondage to decay, he's not making a theological statement. Or maybe he is, insofar that theology is deeply rooted in earthly realities. He was talking about what he saw when he walked through the landscape, right? And he was talking about the fact that if we have the first fruits of the Spirit, if we are Spirit-filled people, we will share in that sorrow, that lament of creation. I'll come back to this. If you have the diagram in front of you, the biblical story diagram that was handed out, now might be a moment to pull that out. Because here's the question. We're lamenting. Those who have the first fruits of the Spirit lament. Why might the Spirit of God also be groaning with creation? Why does this matter so much to God, to the Spirit? Well, let's take a look at this story. And those of you who are online, I think this was emailed to you as well, but I think it's up on your screen as well. Look at the beginning of the story, right? What's the very first thing God does in Genesis 1? But create this incredible, diverse, and beautiful creation, right? Calls the earth to bring forth plants, calls all these creatures to come into being, the birds of the air, the creatures that are in the waters, the land animals, the creeping animals, so insects, all of it is created. And after every day of creating things, God says, it is good. In Hebrew, the word is tov. You know, tov, tov, tov. This is great. This is good. This is fabulous. If you've ever created anything, if you've ever cooked a good meal or sewn something or, you know, created a painting or made some banners and thought, oh, I did a really good job on that, preached a good sermon, and you thought, oh, I did a really good job on that. You know how you have that feeling of satisfaction sometimes? That's how God felt about creation. This is exactly what God was hoping for. That's how the story begins in Genesis 1. But then Genesis 2, God creates an earth creature from the earth. And that's literally what Adam means. So Adam is not a proper name, but Adam from Adama. Adama is the earth. And so Adam is actually earth creature, child of the earth. And Adam is also not gendered. This isn't man. It's earth creature. Gender doesn't enter the story until God has, after looking for a companion for the earth creature and trying out all the animals and realizing, well, they're not going to work. God then takes a rib from Adam, and literally the sense is not taking something from Adam, but splitting Adam. When William Brown, a biblical scholar, calls it the splitting of the atom. This is what happens. Then you get Isha and Isha, man and woman. But before that, this is just, if I could put it this way, a gender non-binary person. There's no gender there. And most fundamentally, though, this is a creature from the earth, an earth creature. And what is that creature that God has, you know, and the text describes it very carefully, God getting down in the soil and sculpting this creature from the soil and then breathing God's breath into the earth creature so that we are made from the earth and the very breath of God. We are image of the earth and image of God, both of those things. And then God calls this earth creature to tend, or till and keep is what the usual translation is, but it's more the sense of serve and observe. To serve and observe creation. That's what we're called to do, to serve and observe the creation. And that's what we're called to be. We're called to be the earth creatures who look after, who serve, who rejoice in this wonderful creation that God has created. And that continues throughout the whole of the story. Genesis chapter 6, the Noah story. We don't usually begin where the story actually begins. I'm gonna come back to the story, so I'll just say it very briefly now. But one of the things it begins with is God's grief over creation. It says in Genesis 6:5, God was grieved over the violence that was on the earth and the fact that the inclination of the human heart was only evil continually. It kind of piles it on, doesn't it? Only evil continually. And God was sorry that God had made humanity on the earth. So we've moved from delight, tov, 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 to, oh no, how could this have gone so badly wrong? God's sorrow and grief over creation and the violence that has been being done to the earth. That comes in verse 11 of chapter 6 of the Noah story. And so the Noah story is God's attempt to deal with the violence that humanity has brought on the earth, to wipe that out and to start afresh with a new creation, with Noah and Noah's family. And God decides at the end of that story, you might remember, God decides never to do this again. And it says, though, that God commits to never doing this again, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil continually. So what's changed isn't us, isn't humanity, but what's changed is God. God's saying, okay, not doing this again. I wonder if that might be because God already had a lot of grief over the violence on the earth. The text tells us that. And I'll just say this as an aside. We tend not to focus on God's grief so much because later translations, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, every time it talked about God's grief in the Hebrew Bible, the Greek translation used the word anger. Because for the Greek gods, anger was an appropriate emotion, but regret and grief was not. The Hebrew Bible talks about God's grief. Could it be that as God watched the flood destroy everything on the earth, that God's heart was wrung with even more grief? And God thought, I don't think I can go through this again. I don't ever want to go through this again. And so God makes a promise. And here's the thing, if you look at the promise in Genesis 9, God makes a covenant with Noah and his family, his sons, his daughter-in-laws, his wife, and with every living creature and with the earth. And the text actually keeps saying it. This is the covenant I'm making with you and with every living thing and all creatures that are on the earth. Here's a rainbow, and it's a sign of my covenant with the earth. When I see the rainbow, it will remind me of my covenant with every living creature and with the earth. It says it 7 times. And if you know anything about how numbers work in the Bible, that's like, okay, just in case you didn't get the point, this is full and complete covenant. This is the first covenant in the Bible. I was raised in the Reformed tradition, and so we talk a lot about covenant, and it's always the covenant with Abraham. I was raised that was the first covenant with the Bible, but the first covenant in the Bible is a covenant with the earth. And of course, what else could it be? We know that God had this incredible delight in creation, right? Of course, God is committed to that creation. And as the story goes on, we see how unfaithfulness to God is demonstrated in what happens to creation. So God calls Abraham and says, through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is in Genesis chapter 12. And what's interesting is I don't think that just refers to people. If you look at Genesis 2, the animals were also created out of the earth. Actually, that's in Genesis 1 too. So when God says that Abraham, you're going to bring blessing to all the families of the earth, I think that means all the animal families too, everything that's come out of the earth. And the first time we see the offspring of Abraham who are supposed to bring this blessing is in Egypt, where all the people of Abraham's sons, all the tribes, are actually enslaved. They're part of this Egyptian economic system. And what do? They're the migrant workers. They work in the fields and they're building storehouses for the export of Egyptian crops, right? And what's the result? What's the result of this essentially industrial agricultural economy that they are caught in? Creation goes crazy. Creation goes haywire, right? God hears their groanings and says, I'm going to come and redeem you. And then what happens? We have all these plagues. And it's not the case that God is just kind of walking through the woods thinking, gee, I need some way to punish the Egyptians. What could it be? Oh, I know, frogs. Frogs would be good. And I'll turn the water to blood. No, Pharaoh had turned the river into an instrument of death. And so God said, okay, if this river is an instrument of death, it will be death. And blood is what it turns into. Creation goes haywire. It becomes deathly. So there are frogs, and there are flies, and there are boils that make people sick. It's kind of almost like a pandemic in the land. There are storms of hail and lightning. There is darkness, as if creation has been undone at the end, right? Because when you abuse creation and people together, and always when you abuse people, you end up abusing creation, then creation goes haywire. And we see this dynamic throughout the whole story. When the people come out of the land and they're given the law, that law is supposed to shape them into a community where God can live with the people in the land. Right? That's why they were given the land, so that God could dwell with them, where the most vulnerable would be cared for, where slaves would be set free, where the land would be cared for. That's why there's a Sabbath for the land. That's why you leave the gleanings, not just for the poor, but for the animals of your fields, right? All of that is together. And when the people don't live up to that, then we get a text like Hosea, where the land mourns. That was one of a text read this morning, where the land mourns and the birds disappear and the fish of the sea are perishing. You get extinctions, the text tells us. This isn't a recent thing that we're talking about. And so the people actually lose the land because they are unable to live faithfully. And some of them do return. I'm obviously painting this story in broad strokes here. And then Jesus comes. And what does Jesus come to do? But to show them how to live faithfully in their place. And Jesus is really explicit about this. I mean, what does he say in Luke 12? But look, you want to know what it looks like to bring the kingdom? Consider the birds. Pay attention to the flowers, the lilies. They're going to tell you what the kingdom looks like. And if you do those things, you'll be seeking my kingdom. There's this call to become a community, that community that the law was supposed to shape them into, the community where God can dwell in the land with the people. And so Jesus shows them what it is to be the true earth creature. Jesus doesn't just show them what God looks like. He does that too, but he also shows them what it is to be a true human being, a true earth creature. And of course, that's the whole meaning of the resurrection as well, right? The cross isn't the central. The cross is central in terms of dealing with evil, but what happens next is central too. Jesus is resurrected from the dead, a bodily resurrection. And it's clear the early disciples weren't talking about some kind of spiritual, Jesus still lives spiritually and now dwells with God in heaven. The disciples were talking about a bodily resurrection in the first century. They had other ways of talking about people who lived on after death. And that's actually how, in their culture, people talked about the Caesars, right? They had something called apotheosis, which means they were raised up to the gods. It didn't mean they came back to life. The resurrection is an affirmation of the fact that we are earth creatures. Our bodies matter because our bodies are created from the earth. And that's why the end of that passage that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 8, he talks about us groaning along with creation as we await the redemption of our bodies. I think he says adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Well, the redemption of our bodies is resurrection language. And Paul talks about resurrection through all the letters, right? The importance of the resurrection, resurrection life. He talks about new creation, 2 Corinthians 5, Galatians chapter 6, and of course Romans 8, creation waiting to be set free. All of that is pointing towards the end of the story. So if we put that diagram back up a moment, you'll notice that the end of the story has a new heaven and a new earth at the end, new creation. The story doesn't end with all of us being whisked away to heaven for all time and eternity. The story ends with God coming to dwell on earth with us in this new heaven and new earth. This is Revelation 21:22. And I sometimes say that if you read Genesis 1 and 2, it's clear that God's original plan was to hang out in kind of a food forest, right? Because he plants all these trees next to a river, because there's all these rivers coming out, with a whole bunch of animals and birds and water creatures and a couple of naked vegetarians. That's what God wanted to do. Just hang out in a forest and a river with all these animals and a couple of naked vegetarians. What do we get at the end of the story? But God coming to dwell in a city that has a river running through it. And on both sides of that river are these trees, the tree of life, that bears fruit 12 months of the year. It's just like God's coming to hang out in this forest food city, right? It's got all these trees with a river, with a whole bunch of fruit eating, maybe vegetarians. By then we've got white robes apparently, but so the nakedness is gone. But that's how the story ends, with God coming to hang out on earth with us again, as if that's what God has been trying to get to all along. So if this is who we are, earth creatures created for the earth, from the earth and for the earth, with the hope of dwelling with God on the new earth, what does this mean then for how we think about the climate crisis? How do we handle all of these griefs that we have in the face of that? And I'd like to look back at the Genesis 6 story for a minute, the Noah story, to talk about that. I'm just going to read you a little bit from the very beginning of Genesis chapter 6, which is a part of the story we never, ever talk about in relation to this text. So this is Genesis 6, verse 1. Let me find it here. Okay. When people, and this is the New Revised Standard Version. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. That word for take there is the same word as Eve taking the fruit. It's the same word Joseph's brothers taking him to throw him in the pit. It often has overtones of violence. So these men are taking wives of all that they chose, whatever wives they chose. right? There are overtones of violence in men taking women here. Then the Lord said, and I should say the sons of God, some people think that that might refer to angels. It could also refer to the kings. Kings were often called the sons of God in the ancient world and in Rome too. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Now, if you've been raised on fairy tales, maybe the Arthurian legends, a phrase like the heroes of old and warriors of renown might sound kind of dashing and adventurous, right? What if I translated it as these were the infamous men of old, the warlords? That's a whole different feel, right? These were the men who engaged in war, the men whose currency was violence. These were the people who, in our modern times, like to invade and drop bombs and terrorize people and crash parties and kidnap people, all that kind of violence. That's what the text is talking about. And then we get that verse I quoted to you earlier. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thought of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved God to God's heart. The grief that God feels about what's happened to the earth. And then later on, verse 11, it talks about how they have ruined the earth. Usually the translation there is they have corrupted the earth, but the word literally in Hebrew is they've ruined the earth. And then God says, so I will ruin them. This text is talking about a context of violence, a context of war that is destroying the earth. That's what God is grieving. And in the middle of that, God calls Noah and says, look, I want you to build this big boat. I want you to get 2 of every animal to take on the boat. I want to get you to take enough food to feed all the animals on the boat. And I can only imagine they also gathered seed to plant after this deluge was over. Now, Noah was a farmer, we find out. So even, I think Noah probably knew that 2 of every kind of animal was not an adequate gene pool for going forward. I live on a farm, and one thing you know on a farm is after a while, you get rid of the males and you got to get a new one in because your gene pool needs to be a little wider than what you can produce if you only have 1 bull or 1 ram, right? Which is, I'm sorry to say, the only use males animals are on a farm is really just, they're just studs, that's all. It's the females we want for other stuff. Noah and his family, they go on the ark. And they have an immersion, an apprenticeship to what it means to look after creation, right? They have almost a year that they're in there, learning the rhythms of the animals, what the animals eat, what happens when these animals give birth or those animals give birth, right? It's this deep apprenticeship into serving and observing creation. And on this, God has pinned the hopes for renewal. So 2 things I think happen in the flood account. I think there's a lot of grief connected for Noah and Noah's family, right? You can only assume that if Noah was actually righteous or just, as the text says, that Noah and his family were also grieved over everything that was happening on the earth. And also would have felt incredible grief as they watched the waters wash over the earth and obliterate their relatives, their friends, everybody and everything that they knew. But there's something else that happens. The first thing that happens in the flood is God deals with the violence on the earth, right? The warlords, those who are creating the violence on the earth, they are wiped away. I mean, the flood sounds like a terrible kind of judgment, but you have to imagine the incredible grief that God is feeling. It's like, you know, it's like what we do when we say, this person has killed too many people. We are putting them in jail so this can never happen again, right? Or the way it used to be, we're killing them when there was capital punishment. You know, sometimes that was a revenge thing, but often that was a, we never want this to happen again. We don't want this to happen anymore. Um, there's that kind of a dynamic. Violence is dealt with. But the other dynamic is the creation of a place, an ark, where life can be nurtured till that judgment is done, so that the earth can begin again, so new creation can happen again. I'm currently writing a book on climate grief, and this is Genesis 6 is my chapter 2 of the book, and each of the chapters focuses on kind of a climate crisis in the biblical story. So the exile is another one, Jeremiah, first century. Each chapter focuses on some actions we can do that arise out of the biblical story. So I'm just giving you my chapter 2 actions today. When we get to Zacchaeus, we have reparations happening in the story. What does that look like in our context? What does that look like in Canada? What does it look like in the US? It's very different, right? Because and reparations in the US is to the Black community. Somehow they're not talking about Indigenous peoples much there. There's a history. Canada, we're talking about that in relation to Indigenous peoples, or we should be. I think in the Noah story, two things. One is we need to stop the violence. And stopping the violence does not mean that we go and try to destroy all the people doing this violent, go to the oil sands and try to kill everybody there. But it does mean that we do think about where the violence is being committed. And violence, if I've been to the tar sands, I've been to Alberta. It is horrible. In fact, it's probably the most traumatic thing I've done in my life, was to go there and see what's happened to the earth and to talk to the Indigenous communities there. When I came back from there, I stopped taking hot showers because I just thought, you know what? I can't be using all this propane. We have propane for our showers. I can't be using all of this just to get clean any longer. And it turns out I really like cold showers, so that's fine. Or maybe I just got used to them. But I spend a lot of my life thinking, how can we not be relying on oil that does so much violence to the earth? So that's the one thing. We are enmeshed in a system, yes. I drove down here in a car this morning, but I don't heat with oil. So if Christians began to think about net zero, about heat pumps in their homes, about what they can do to stop their own reliance on oil, that's one thing. That's one thing that starts to stop the violence. The other thing that I think comes out of this story is the biodiversity thing. We are in a mass extinction. That's what the flood story was, a mass extinction. What can we do in the middle of that? How can we create arcs in our own places, whether that be on in our churchyards or in our neighborhoods or in our own yard, to start to create spaces where biodiversity can flourish. And the bottom of the pecking order for biodiversity is insects. If the insects continue to crash at the rate they're going, we will not be here any longer. They can live without us, but we cannot live without them. They pollinate our food, they pollinate all the plants that keep the earth ticking, and they have other ecosystem functions in terms of ensuring that we're not sitting around in all the excrement of all creatures, right? Bugs deal with that. Bugs deal with the dead plants. Bugs create soil. They do everything for us. So what can you do to create a pollinator place, a place where biodiversity can flourish? We started creating wider pollinator areas on our farm seriously 3 years ago. We had let things rewild before that. 3 years ago, I began to photograph insects on the farm. The first year, I photographed, I think, 5 different species of bumblebees. Um, I keep forgetting to count. We have at least 15 species of bumblebees on our property that I photographed this year. I don't know if I just wasn't seeing them before, but I actually think they weren't there. I think they've come back. So, what can you do? There's a guy, and I'm just going to put this up, and then I will actually stop because I think I'm past my time. There is somebody named Douglas Tallamy. And if you can get this book, it's great. It's called Nature's Best Hope. And he talks about creating pocket prairies on your lawns, right? If half the grass, he's talking about the US, he's talking about something he calls homegrown national park. If half the grass that existed across the US and Canada was turned into pollinator gardens, we could reverse the decline of insects. We could create those arcs of biodiversity so that even as the climate warms, we have created habitat where things can flourish. And this is crucial. And these are doable things I'm saying here. Now, you might have gifts that you can use around these things. And I'll leave you just with that one last thought. Throughout the biblical story, there are those who are so passionate for the kingdom that they get together in community to think about what does it look like for me to use the gifts that I have. Paul talks about our gifts a lot to meet the crisis of our time. And this is something I think that should be central to our church communities too, that we're putting all of our imagination and all of our cunning, all of our creativity into thinking about how we can meet this crisis so that we can become the servants of creation that we were called to be. And that's it. And I'm sorry I've gone 10 minutes over.
Thank you, Sylvia. You've tickled our imaginations, stirred our hearts, and I'm sure called forth some questions and some conversation that we want to share with you. But first, we need to attend to some other things. So take a quick 10-minute break, if you will, and then come back ready to engage Sylvia in conversation, if you would. See you in 10 minutes.
It's hard to find those, where do you find, especially when, not always. I will her. That's what I was doing. I'm writing a legal business on the name right now. Two minor things. So we just this week. The celebration of the great was the co-creation No. I'm I know, represent the Quest. Except it's not very I just think that was really strange. I was in touch with Paul about what he did there. As the day, I don't know. Anyway, Paul. I'm going to take a quick break and then read one.
Come on back in and take a seat if you will.
I mean, because I'm,
Minutes behind our
yeah.
schedule, so I'll make sure we do Well, welcome back. As I had mentioned earlier, we want to engage Sylvia in some conversation, and we hope that those of you online are going to be able to participate in this as well. Just a reminder, if you are online, there is a chat function there on the screen. Feel free to post a question in there for Sylvia, and we will do our best to watch for that and include that in the midst of our conversation too. So, who wants to get started? Always that first question. That's always the hard one. Who's got a question for Sylvia? Calvin.
If a church would like to do more to contribute to the biodiversity on their property, what steps would you recommend they take to begin doing that?
Oh, what a great question. Okay, if a church wanted to do more about the biodiversity on their property, I mean, the first thing you need to, this is kind of a permaculture answer. You want to spend some time just looking at what land you have and what kind of uses happen on that land. Like, do people from your neighborhood walk across there? Um, uh, you also want to think about your neighborhood and what your neighborhood needs are. So, is there, you know, are you in a suburban area? Are you in the middle of the city? Are you, are you rural? All of those will have different answers. And then, what are your neighborhood needs? So you can increase biodiversity and also plant food, right? Um, One thing that's important also for bird biodiversity is trees that have lots of caterpillars, because any bird can eat seeds in the winter. Not all of them do, but a lot can. But every single bird needs caterpillars to feed the young in their nests. They can't eat seeds. And for instance, a chickadee that has, say, three chicks in their nest needs something like 5,000 caterpillars to rear them to adulthood. So you need shrubs. You need pollinator plants, but you also need shrubs and some trees that have a lot of caterpillars on them. So, like, it's a good thing if you have trees that have holes in the leaves, right? Because that means you have insects on those trees. So, take a look at your property. I would probably consult with somebody who knows something about permaculture and ask whether you can create something that's a little bit of what they call a food forest on your property. So can you put some fruit trees on that property? Can you put underneath them some shrubs, like, currants, raspberries? And then can you plant some annual food crops and then surround those with other perennial pollinator plants? Then you have a lot going on, and you can do that in a really small space. So that would be one thing you can do. If you don't have people who can look after food plantings, right? Because if you're going to plant a vegetable garden, you need some people who can water it and look after it. Then I would think of doing a denser planting of trees and shrubs. And they call these now these little mini forests, actually, where you plant a lot of trees quite close together and have an underlayer of shrubs as well. And that just provides a space for insects, and then I would put perennials around it and some shade ones amongst it. That's something you don't have to look after as much, but it provides this dense kind of cover for insects, for birds, and for small animals. And you'll have a little ecosystem going on there. And you know what? You can find this stuff on YouTube. Google food forest or mini forest. So, but I would just start by looking at the needs and resources of your congregation. I hope that kind of gets at it.
Being Calvin's pastor, I know that things are about to change, right, Calvin? I see we have a question that's come in online. So it says most of the world's population live in cities. So what are your suggestions for urban dwellers, I guess?
Mhm. That's a really, really good question. If I still lived in Toronto, I'd be doing a lot of guerrilla gardening because um, there are in most cities a lot of edge spaces that could have plantings in them, could have pollinator gardens, could even have fruit trees put in them. So, for instance, where we used to live in Toronto, at Oakwood and Vaughan, the beer store had these in the edge of the parking lot, just these strips of grass that for years, uh, and I never did anything about this because I just had small children at the time. I think if we'd stayed, I probably would have got to it. But for years, I was planning what was going to go in that space. It was just like one day, me and a few neighbors were going to go, and we were just going to dig everything up and put in a whole bunch of perennials in there. And the city, when they came to mow, hopefully would just say, "Oh, okay then." um, so I think there are opportunities in cities, even for people who live in apartment buildings, to kind of look around their neighborhoods. And uh, all these things are best done in community. Everything's best done in community because otherwise you're carrying the weight of the world on your own shoulders. But, find some like minded people, look around where the places are where things could be planted. If you're in apartment buildings, think about your roof space, and if there's and there mostly are nowadays accessible roof spaces on condos and apartment buildings. Think about putting pollinator areas up there. My daughter now lives in a co-op at Yonge and Eglinton, and they have all these planters up on their roof area. It's the roof of a public library up there at Yonge and Eglinton. But there's a lot more space. So she's on a gardening committee. So now they're starting to think about what else can we put here, because that's actually going to create continuity for pollinators in that whole neighborhood. But even in urban context, people have lawns, right? They might not be very big, but they're there. And it's one of my joys walking around a city like Toronto is all the front yards where people are already have got rid of the grass and are doing planting. But here's the caveat. Often those plantings are not native plants, and some of them are exotics. If you're not planting native plants, if you're planting exotics, they will not be habitat or food for native pollinators. So you might have replaced a lawn and it looks great because it's got various flowers coming at different times. But if it's lilacs and daylilies, it might as well be a lawn as far as insects are concerned. So find out what's local to the area. Plant echinacea, plant bergamot, plant, foam flower, plant plant coreopsis. Find the things that are going to come back year after year that are actually native, that will feed the insects that are in your area. And if you have to plant one tree, plant a willow or an oak, because they have a lot of caterpillars on them.
Thank you, Sylvia. Another question's come in online. I've never heard the interpretation of sons of God in Genesis 6 that you offered. Are there sources for this perspective that you can point us to? I found it quite compelling. Thank you, Alan.
Okay. There are sources, and I don't know what they are off the top of my head because I've been reading an awful lot on Genesis 6. So if is it Alan? Alan, if you wanted to get my email address from somebody on the organizing committee and email me with a question, I can take a look at my notes and let you know. I think it's a Jewish commentator that I read, though. There's a Jewish scholar, and she's written a book on Genesis, and I have a feeling it's her that I got that from. But that's all I can say at this point.
Alan, if you can't, if you don't know anyone else in the community here, you can always send an email to gatheringregistrar@gmail.com, and we can channel that.
Actually, I'll give you This is the email address for Bible Remixed, my teaching platform. info@bibleremixed.ca. And you can send an email. Anybody can send an email to that address, and I'll respond. It will get to me. Maybe not the same day, but I will check it.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Sylvia. Another question for Sylvia. What do you think?
I mean, I can just pick up the phone and ask you this, but I'm interested in your response. Because we've just moved up to the same area that you're in Trent Lakes, and we have not found a church community that we can be a part of because so many of the churches are in survival mode and are not paying attention to what's going on in the world in lots of ways, but certainly in the terms of the climate crisis, where it seems to not have occurred to them that the church has anything to do with what's going on with our climate crisis. And I mean, I'd be interested in other people's here reactions to this too, but if a person finds themselves in a church where nobody seems to see that there's a connection between being a follower of Jesus and being a part of a solution for the climate crisis, like where would you start?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I mean, it really does depend on the church community too. There's different reasons why churches do not see this as do not see the crisis connecting to Christian faith. So, in some communities, there is still an incredible emphasis on the fact that we're all going to end up in heaven one day. So the earth doesn't matter, right? So then you've got a whole theological construct there that you're dealing with, which is very deeply rooted in Christian tradition, right? It goes all the way back to the way Platonic dualism has kind of affected our interpretation of the biblical text. In certain traditions, if you start doing Bible study on things, that can actually cause a change in people's thinking, because some church traditions take, the biblical text very seriously. The Anglican church that's no way to make change in the Anglican church, because that's not where the emphasis is for a lot of people. I say this as somebody who goes to Anglican churches, who's Anglican now. The church I grew up in, I remember doing a Bible study on Romans 12, and if your enemy is hungry, feed them, and if they're thirsty, give them something to drink, and tied that in with the militarisms of Romans 13, and was talking about how we treat our enemies. And afterwards, one of the elders prayed and said, "Dear God," or "Oh God, you call us to love our enemies, and we don't want to, but it's written down right there." And so then he continued to pray for those that he can. This was shortly after 9/11. So he was praying. He started praying for the people of Iraq, whom he considered his enemies at the time. But I was blown away. I thought, wow, okay. So for the people in this community, the fact we just did this in-depth Bible study actually changed their mind on something. So it really does depend on the community. In other communities, there's a sense that, there's never a sense that what the biblical text says connects to how they live in their daily lives, right? Those communities, you're doing, a whole capturing, talking about how the biblical story captures your imagination so deeply that you want to live it out in every part of your life, because it's this incredibly compelling vision. Those communities need to catch a glimpse of that compelling vision first, right? I mean, because there's a lot of different things going on in churches. And particular, actually, Karen, where you live, and I say this as somebody who lives in the same area, there's a lot of churches that are just, this is the social group for those people. This is who they have coffee with once a week. So then you have a whole other problem. So mean, my experience in a lot of places is you have your church communities that you're trying to shape the imagination of this community around the biblical vision in relation to the crises we face. But don't overlook connections with other communities, other people in the community already doing that kind of work. Because at a certain point, for me, there's a sense of, well, look, these folks are already doing some of this stuff. So, like, I was gonna say I'm gonna jump into bed with them, but that doesn't sound really good. I'm gonna hitch my star to their wagon and start doing this work. And then sometimes what happens is people in the church communities say, oh, how can we be involved with what this other group is doing as well? And that kind of thing happens. That's a very rambling, open answer. It's a tough one. Mm-hmm.
It made me think of a woman in my congregation who is passionately involved in GASP, Grandmother's Act to Save the Planet, and inspires some of the rest of us by her involvements. It's not a church-initiated initiative, but it's something that spills over from her faith into her faith community. So. Now, I haven't had a chance to read this yet, so this is dangerous, but let's see. Given that the vast majority of humanity's contribution to climate change and the environmental crisis is linked to massive and longstanding global economic and geopolitical forces, how are people of faith collectively ever going to influence and change those seemingly intractable power structures, all the more difficult in our increasingly polarized social landscape? Thank you, Michael.
In 25 words or less,
Yeah.
Okay. This is where somebody like Douglas Tallamy in his book, and other people who are working on kind of net zero initiatives for churches and in communities are basically saying, look, we've got these vast economic and political structures. How can we collectively imagine what individuals can do, not just together, but in community together, that doesn't need government approval, that doesn't need Trudeau to give us money for it, that can work under the radar of what legislation currently is. What are the things that we can bond together to do, and doing those things can create a tipping point, right? Where things start to shift culturally. So that's where that's sort of increasingly how I've been thinking of an answer to this question, because there are all these groups. I mean, you mentioned GASP. There's a new seniors group actually that's, I think, in Bob Cajun, working on climate change stuff. There are all these grassroots things happening where people are saying, forget the people with power. Like, they're just not going to do it for us. We need to find ways to just start initiatives, and we know what has to be done. We know we have to start shifting our use of fossil fuels. We know we have to increase biodiversity. We know that we need to start educating people about this. Like, we all know the things that have to be done. So let's just find ways to do it in the face of what our governments are doing. And actually, even though the US, when you look at what's happening in the United States now, it seems like an incredibly depressing place. There are a lot of local grassroots initiatives happening across the whole of the United States that collectively together are going to make a huge difference. And that kind of thing's happening in Canada too. So I think part of what we need to be doing actually is collecting those stories of hope, saying, I know that people are doing this. We know people are doing this. We know people are doing this. And that then encourages people to say, oh, well, I can do that. That's within my grasp, and big snowball from there.
Another question.
Are you familiar with book Planetwise? No, I'm not. But I'd love to know more about it. I'll write it down.
Anyone else familiar with that? I'm not sure if that's a typo. Planetwise. by someone, I think is what they were trying to say, but I'm not sure.
Or is
Thank-
Malcolm Rust the
Malcolm-
author of Planet Wise?
No, Malcolm's a member of our community.
Okay.
So Malcolm, you may want to elaborate on that one for us. Any other questions? Here's one from Karen.
I work in hospice palliative care, and so your remarks about the grief around creation really resonated with me. And bereavement educators are telling us that there is coming a big groundswell of grief, and no doubt creation is part of that. And I appreciate what you had to say. And we know with individuals who are experiencing grief that they're in survival mode, and often before even reaching for the positive things about what to do about it, they have to allow themselves the time and the space for lament. And I'm wondering if for a church or a community, that is an important thing to do, first of all. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but there's something so sacred about processing that grief in God's presence.
Thanks. That's a fabulous question. I think lament is actually what we're called to do in this moment, for all kinds of reasons. I mean, when Paul's talking about us groaning with creation, he's not saying we groan with creation, then we try to move on. But no, we're in the middle of it because we're living in what Parker Palmer calls the tragic gap, right? We know the way things are going to be, and we know the way things are, and all we can do in that gap between those things is lament, is give voice to sorrow. So, and I think the fact that the Spirit in Romans 8 is also lamenting and groaning says actually something about this is what it means to be in the Spirit, right? Being in the Spirit doesn't mean to be happy, clappy, joyful, but you're actually entering into the sorrow of the world, into the groaning of creation. And I think that's actually incredibly important. We spend some time. Our chapter in Romans Disarmed that talks about creation begins with a lament for the land. And I realized this when we live on a farm, and our neighbor every year would kill one of his pastures with Roundup, grow wheat on it for the year, and then turn it back into pasture. And that way he rotated the wheat around the farm. The field immediately next to us, the fall that he killed it with Roundup, which almost killed me, because it was a beautiful pasture. He died that winter in a farming accident. And so his partner now rents out the fields that were not pasture when he died. So it is now permanently soy or corn. It's a dead field. Every time I left the house for a while, I would be overcome with grief about this field. And I would try to fight it. And finally, I remember thinking, no, this is where I should be. Somebody has to lament what happened to these animals. And this field slopes down to a marsh. Like the implications of Roundup on this field are terrifying to me for the marsh and where the sandhill cranes live. And so that's when I first started thinking about lament as a faithful response to what we see. There is no other way to respond to what happened to that field or to what happens to the other places that we love. Just as grief is a faithful response when somebody we love dies. We can also think then, and I'm glad you mentioned palliative care. We also, I think, need to think about how we engage with a world that is dying. There's a woman who's written a book. She's British, and the book is called Words for a Dying World. She's a Christian. Hannah Malcolm is her name. And this is stories of people all over the world, indigenous peoples, farmers in India, scholars, just short reflections on how do we engage with the grief we feel over climate destruction and loss. And I've been thinking about how we engage with the dying world. A sanctuary in downtown Toronto that works with folks who are homeless. Where I'm on the board. I went to a grieving event they had for people in the community who had died during COVID. There were pictures of 60 people up around the space, some of whom I knew well and some of whom I didn't know at all. And what they had done is they'd taken pictures of everybody, beautiful pictures, because they had some photographers in the community. And these pictures were posted, and then underneath each picture, they wrote about what gifts those people had brought to the community. So it was a very overwhelming and moving event, but it made me think about what if this is how we thought of creation? I mean, the people whose pictures were up there were all people who had incredible potential, who had gifts that were not appreciated in the context that they grew up in, were people whose potential had never been realized, were people who were abused and violated. And yet the sanctuary community celebrated their beauty and their gifts were, and grieved for them. Creation is going through the same thing. Creation has offered us gifts that we have not taken. We have responded with violence. We have responded with abuse. What is it now, as we look around all the ways that creation is suffering, if we started to celebrate the beauty of creation, if we started to name the gifts that creation offers us, and if we then folded that all into our grief over what's happening to the earth? I think that might be one way, at least, to hold our grief and make it meaningful in relation to what's happening to the earth.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh,
there's one up there. Do you know the book Planet Wise by Dave Bookless?
Bookless, yeah.
InterVarsity Press. Bookless is National Director of Arosha in the UK. Lots of practical suggestions for individuals and congregations.
So I haven't read Planet Wise by Dave Bookless. I know him. I mean, I don't know him personally. I know of him because I'm very familiar with Arosha. And so that book, now that I see Dave's name connected to it, it's actually on my list of books I need to take a look at. I do recommend to any of you who want to know more about churches and helping churches to think about creation care. Arasha is also present in Canada, in Vancouver and in Manitoba. They do conservation work. They have a community shared agriculture farm. They do day camps for kids. They publish curricula for churches, liturgy for churches. They work a lot with evangelical churches, so they have something called Good Seed Sunday, because Earth Sunday wouldn't have gone over so well with some of their churches. Their curriculum is pretty good. I find it theologically a little bit heavy sometimes, but I really encourage you, especially if you're looking for ways to make your congregation more aware of climate issues. Arasha is a great resource. So take a look at them. And you can just Google them and you'll find out about their Surrey location and their and in Hamilton as well. Arasha has a site in Hamilton, Cedar Haven Farm, which is out near kind of Copetown, just down the road from Valens Conservation Area, Cedar Haven Farm. And they do programming there as well. And they also, at least twice a year, have a wild church meeting, kind of an outdoor church service. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Eucharist Church. It's kind of nominally Baptist. Eucharist, Nina Drenth, Nina Shurman Drenth, who's at Eucharist, one of the pastors there. Yeah, she does the wild church at Arasha. So yeah, that's a good place to get hooked in as well. Yeah, and Nina studied with me, and she's great. So yeah.
I'm not quite sure, Sylvia, how to say thank you completely for what you've given us today. The first thing I want to say is that I got up at 4 o'clock this morning so I could drive here from Ottawa. And I was afraid I was going to fall asleep, but I didn't. Because this has been really, really helpful and informative and opened a whole bunch of things that I think we needed to think about in a whole lot of ways. And I think we need you back again sometime. But it really has been a very helpful thing for me anyway. And I wish more of our people had thought it worthwhile coming to, because I had a couple of people say to me, we've done all this stuff on the climate and so on. Do we need to keep on doing it? But we do. And thank you very much for sharing this with us today and for the insights you've given us. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thanks for all your great questions. That always helps make the day.
Yes, thank you, Sylvia. You did not disappoint.
Let's say one more piece of shameless self-promotion. I put the website or the email address for our website. BibleRemix.ca is the website that has the information about my teaching. So if anybody's interested in a course in Advent, they're usually Sunday nights, the classes. And this fall will be on the Psalms, or this Advent, 4 weeks on the Psalms. And the all the information about the Psalms course isn't up yet, but it will be up by tomorrow. So you could take a look there if you're interested. And other courses I'll be offering happen on there. This is what freelancers do. They have to end with shameless self-promotion.
Not a problem. Hey, I'm going to open up our annual general meeting and I will call it to order. The first business item is the meeting minutes from the meeting October 29th, 2022, and they were circulated. Gary has moved the adoption. Calvin Edie has seconded that motion. Are there any errors or omissions in the minutes? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? I'm assuming it passes because I have no idea what the vote is online. The second item is our annual report the past year, and again, it was circulated. It's entitled Annual Report 2022, The Gathering of Baptists. It was circulated. I have a motion to accept this. Victoria and Gary. Are there any issues, any corrections, any items to discuss in the report? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? I'm sure hoping that everybody online voted yes. We're gonna have to figure that one out, Dave. Okay, the third item is our audit review 2020. And again, this was circulated, right, Gary? Is there anything you would like to add about that? Nope. Can I have a motion to accept this? I have Gary, Calvin. Any questions, concerns? Okay, you heard that? Dave has extra copies of all these things. Okay, seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Move on. Wow, you guys are, we're going to go through this real fast. The next thing is our financial statement. Again, this was circulated.
circulated on or about the 11th of January of 2023. And have we looked at the audit report yet? Yeah, we just did, yeah. It's been audited. No corrections noted. So I'm pleased to present it for approval.
Okay, so I'm going to go Fred this time, Calvin. Okay, any concerns, comments, issues, discussion, points of discussion? Fred. Fred. All in favor? Any opposed? It is carried. The next is the report of the nominating committee. I assume this has also been circulated. Disregard the credentials committee at this stage. And Fred, I'll allow you to present it.
Just to say that, and I hope this will get picked up on the. Here comes the microphone.
Now it is.
Just to say that this is the nominating committee's report for the board of the gathering. The first one said secretary treasurer, and then the secretary reminded me that it used to be two positions, and it has been one person, but it's still two positions. So it's separated with Gary's name in both of them. We really could use one or two more members on the steering committee, on the board rather. And so if anybody is interested, we meet normally by Zoom. So you don't have to travel anywhere. You can sit in your living room and or your den or whatever and be part of the meeting. We really could use a couple more members. So if anyone is really interested, please try to let me know. You can do that through the gathering registration website, and then Kim would pass it on to me. So please let me know. I would move the exception of the nominations committee.
Calvin is seconded. I will make one note. We've used the term moderator, past moderator. We've gone to become a board. We're no longer the steering committee. So technically that probably should be chair and past chair. Or president. Yeah.
We'll correct that.
I should probably point out, Blake, that historically, throughout the entire history of our organization, when there was a secretary and a treasurer, they were married. So technically, they might have to marry Gary in order to fill the other role. Just throwing that out there.
I don't know why we give you a mic. I really don't.
Don't know if that helps or hinders. I don't.
Okay. Did I get a mover and a seconder? Yes, I did. Okay, is there any real discussion? Okay, seeing none, I will call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Passed? Okay. Number 6, the membership report.
All the individual names on the membership report are, of course, recorded and have been shared with the board. As of last night, we had 84 who are considered Class A memberships in the corporation. 56 members paid, 57. 57, I got one, I got 20 bucks in my pocket. 57 members have paid so far this year. We have 7 who've paid beyond 2023. Clergy credentialed, we have 11, 6 of whom carry licenses to marry under our Baptist, Gathering of Baptist umbrella.
Gary has moved it. Do I have a seconder besides Calvin? Elizabeth, thank you. Any questions, comments? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? It is carried. Okay, we have the report of the Credentials Committee.
Kent, are we able to bring Ron on? Through the miracle of modern technology, we're going to try to bring Ron into our. Ron's been with us all day, but
Yeah, Ron, go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
see if he can make this report.
All right. I hope you can't see me.
Oh, but we can hear you, Ron.
Good. The Credentials Committee had a relatively quiet year. We did have conversations with a number of potential candidates for credentialing. However, we only have one approved candidate. It is my pleasure to present for credentialing the Reverend Michael Lafleur of Oakville. Mr. Lafleur is a 1991 graduate of Ontario Theological Seminary, now Tyndall Seminary, and was ordained to ministry in 1992 by the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches. He served as senior pastor at Erin Mills Baptist Church, and then was a church planting minister at Chartwell Baptist Church in Oakville. In 2000, Michael founded a parachurch ministry now called the Infusion Network, which creates audiovisual media to help religious organizations to communicate their vision and affect social change. He also serves as teaching pastor at Rock and River Congregational Church in Etobicoke. In applying for credentials with the Gathering of Baptists, Michael stated that my theological views on various matters, such as women in ministry and affirming LGBTQ plus persons, have been diverging from the fellowship for many years now, and it is time to be affiliated with those more open to a generous orthodoxy than our forefathers were. From everything I have seen and read on your website, your core values and beliefs are congruent with mine, and in good conscience, I would welcome the opportunity to be formally affiliated with your Gathering of Baptists. Some of us had a chance to meet Michael at our spring sessions in Burlington, and the Credentials Committee subsequently reviewed his documents and conducted an extensive interview with him via Zoom. The committee is unanimous in recommending that Michael be granted credentials by the Gathering. I move that the application of Reverend Michael Lafleur for accreditation within the Gathering of Baptists as a previously accredited clergy person under the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches be approved.
Seconder. Gowan?
Michael is online, incidentally.
Want him to speak?
No.
Okay. Hi, Michael. Are there any comments, concerns, discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Congratulations, Michael. You are now credentialed with the Gathering of Baptists. So you need to update your report. No. Yes. Okay, number 8, appointments of the Credentials Committee for the members 2023.
Credentials Committee as listed in the, oh, here comes the mic again. I would move that we appoint the Credentials Committee as listed on that nominations report. You see all the names there: Rex Deverell, Rob Campbell, Ron Getz, Karen Hilliker, Margaret Bell, Elizabeth Demery, and Colin Cousins, who is currently acting as the chair.
May I have a seconder to the motion, please? Dave. Okay, any comments, concerns, questions, rebuttals? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? It is carried. Policy statement, credentialing and ordination. So I guess that's you, Gary. Circulated?
Pardon me?
Is it circulated?
I believe it was circulated. I hope it was. We intended to. And the reason for writing this policy is that people do tend to confuse what the Credentials Committee does and what the church or ministry body does in terms of ordaining one per Christian ministry. So that's the whole purpose. And I've used it a few times with people who are wanting to be ordained by the gathering, but who are not credentialed by the gathering. So that's its reason.
Need a motion for that?
I move that we accept it.
Okay, Gary has moved to accept it. Can I have a seconder? Calvin? I think our family name's in there enough, Calvin. Any comments, questions, concerns? Seeing none, call for the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Is there any other business for the AGM? Seeing none, I will adjourn the meeting, and guess what time it is? We are right back on time. Are there any announcements to share? Dave, is there any news on the next gathering?
Yes, there will be one.
Somebody
Yes,
take the mic
yes.
from him.
It will be at the end of the last Saturday in April, as usual. We are still looking. We're working on a theme. We have done some work on that, just so you know, we're not winging it all the way. We're also looking for a location, and one of the location needs these days is that we need a location that can provide the combination of in-person and online. And once again, that's a great opportunity for me to say thank you to Kent, who's done an incredible job of enabling everyone online to be with us today. Thank you, Kent. Thank you. So if your church has this capability and would like to host us, please reach out to me. I would love to have a conversation with you about that, or to Karen, or to Gary, or to Larry. Thank you.
Okay, I will adjourn the AGM, and we'll have a benediction. May you depart knowing the invitation of God to move from comfort to insecurity, from what we know and what we have yet to discover, from where we have been to where we have yet to go, from safety to a place of risk. Go in the example of the saints before you, the Israelites in the wilderness, Paul blind in Damascus awaiting for Ananias. Go in the name of Jesus, our Christ, who said, "Follow me," without saying where he was going, just promising transformation and relationship with the living God along the way. Amen.